What if the story you're telling yourself about who you are is the only thing standing between you and the person you're trying to become? Not your circumstances, not your history, not your genetics or your upbringing or the particular combination of failures that brought you to this moment. Just the story, the one you've been rehearsing so long you've stopped noticing it's a rehearsal. Here is the uncomfortable truth that behavioral science keeps arriving at from different directions. You are not discovering yourself. You are constructing yourself, continuously, in real time. From the raw material of your own beliefs, your repeated behaviors, and the narrative you've decided, consciously or not, is true about you. This video is about weaponizing that process. What we're going to do is take a mechanism that the human mind uses against itself, cognitive dissonance, and reverse its direction. Instead of letting the tension between who you are and who you want to be paralyze you, you're going to use that tension as fuel. You are going to selectively, deliberately, and without apology introduce a new identity into your own psychology, and then behave your way into it before you believe it. The colloquial term for installing a belief that precedes the evidence is gaslighting. And for the purposes of this video, we are going to do exactly that, to ourselves, with full awareness, with precision, and with complete indifference to whether it feels true yet. You are already gaslighting yourself. You just didn't choose it. Every time your inner voice says you're not a disciplined person, that's the installed narrative, not a fact. Every time you sit down to work and feel the pull toward distraction and interpret that pull as evidence of who you are accepting a story that your subconscious wrote without your consent. Every time you say, "I've always been this way," you are reinforcing a cognitive structure that has no more claim to truth than any other belief you've ever held and later discarded. The mind does not hold beliefs because they are true. It holds beliefs because they are familiar, because they reduce uncertainty, because they cohere with other beliefs already present in the system. The belief that you are undisciplined is not a conclusion drawn from evidence. It is a pattern that was installed, reinforced, and eventually mistaken for identity. This is the foundational premise of what we're doing. The self is not a fixed thing you discover. It is a dynamic narrative you maintain, and narratives can be rewritten. Cognitive dissonance, the psychological tension that arises when your beliefs and your behaviors conflict, is the mechanism the mind uses to maintain internal consistency. When you behave in a way that contradicts your self-concept, the discomfort you feel is your brain trying to resolve the conflict. Most people resolve it by reverting to the old behavior. They bring the action back in line with the belief. What we are going to do is the opposite. We are going to install the new belief first, before the behavior confirms it, and then use the dissonance between that belief and your current behavior as pressure. Pressure that pushes the behavior forward, not backward. The mind will try to resolve the tension. You are going to make sure the only resolution available is the one that serves you. Motivation fails. Discipline systems fail. Habit stacks, accountability partners, productivity frameworks, they all fail eventually. Not because they're poorly designed, because they're operating at the wrong level. They're trying to change behavior without changing identity. And behavior without identity is always temporary. It requires constant maintenance, constant willpower, constant recommitment. The moment the external pressure lifts, the challenge ends, the accountability partner disappears, the motivation fades, the behavior reverts. Because underneath the new behavior, the old self-concept is still running. Identity is different. Identity is automatic. You don't exert willpower to act like yourself. You don't motivate yourself to maintain your own personality. You simply behave consistently with who you believe you are, without deliberation, without effort, without needing to remember to do it. This is why elite performers across domains, athletes, surgeons, special operations personnel, high-stakes negotiators, all demonstrate the same psychological signature. They have an identity that is not available for renegotiation based on temporary emotional states. Their sense of who they are precedes their performance. It doesn't follow from it. The research on this is unambiguous. James Clear articulated the framework accessibly, but the underlying science goes back decades through social psychology, self-perception theory, and the study of identity-based behavior change. Behavior that flows from identity is sustainable. Behavior that is imposed on top of an unchanged identity is not. So the question becomes, How do you change the identity first, before the evidence exists to justify the change? The answer is selective cognitive dissonance. You introduce the new identity as if it is already true. You create the internal conflict between that installed belief and your current behavior. And then you resolve the conflict, every single time, in favor of the new identity. Over enough repetitions, the new identity becomes the path of least resistance. Not because you've convinced yourself of something false, because you've behaved your way into something real. The first stage is the most uncomfortable. It will feel like lying. You are going to state, with complete calm and zero emotional qualification, a version of yourself that does not yet exist in behavior. And you are going to treat it as already true. Not as a goal, not as an aspiration, not as something you are working toward, as a current fact. This is the install, and the precision of the language matters more than almost anything else in this process, because the subconscious is a literal system. It does not process hedging well. I am becoming more disciplined is a statement about a future state. The subconscious files it accordingly as something not yet real. I am someone who executes without negotiation is a present tense identity claim. The subconscious registers it differently as a current condition to be maintained. The install is not affirmation. Affirmations fail because they are emotionally performed. You're trying to feel the thing as true while simultaneously knowing it isn't. That gap is felt immediately, and the subconscious rejects the installation. The Gaslight protocol operates without emotion. Clinical, flat, matter of fact. You are not trying to convince yourself through enthusiasm. You are simply stating a fact about the operating system. You choose one identity statement, specific, behavioral, non-negotiable in its phrasing, not "I am disciplined," too abstract, too available for contradiction. Something like, "I am someone who begins without waiting for readiness," or "I complete what I start, regardless of how I feel midway through," or "I do not negotiate with resistance, I move through it." You write it. You read it once in the morning, once before the task, not with conviction, with the same tone you'd use to read a fact about the weather. Cold, accurate, already true. The subconscious begins building the internal scaffolding of that identity the moment you stop treating it as aspirational and start treating it as descriptive. The identity install creates the frame. Now you have to give the frame something to hold. Stage 2 is evidence planting. You are going to manufacture the behavioral proof that the installed identity requires, not by performing grand acts of discipline, but by executing small, undeniable, non-negotiable actions that the new identity would perform as a matter of course. This is where most identity change attempts collapse. People install the new identity and then wait for a dramatic behavioral shift. It doesn't come. Not because the identity install failed, because the subconscious requires evidence before it fully adopts the new frame. The belief and the behavior need to converge. You have to plant the evidence deliberately, consistently, at a scale the subconscious cannot dismiss. The mechanism here is self-perception theory, one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. We infer our own identities from our own behavior the same way we infer other people's. When you repeatedly observe yourself doing a thing, you update your belief about who you are. Small actions, consistently repeated, become identity evidence. The subconscious looks at the pattern and draws a conclusion. This is who we are now. The evidence plants need to be non-negotiable minimums, not aspirational targets, floors. The thing you will do regardless of mood, energy, circumstance, or resistance. The minimum that the new identity would never fail to produce. If the identity is, "I am someone who begins without waiting for readiness," the evidence plant might be, open the document. Every day. Within 60 seconds of sitting down. No conditions, no warm-up, no deliberation. Just open the document. That's it. That is the entire behavioral commitment for the first installation phase. One action, undeniable, repeated until the subconscious has enough data points to update its model. The dissonance between the installed identity and any failure to perform the minimum becomes intolerable, not because of willpower, but because the mind is trying to maintain internal consistency. You have told it who you are. Failing to open the document contradicts that statement. The mind resolves the conflict by opening the document. You have just used cognitive dissonance as a behavioral forcing function. The third stage is the most psychologically sophisticated, and the one that determines whether the identity shift is permanent or temporary. Every time you complete a non-negotiable minimum, your subconscious generates a micro-narrative. A sentence, often unconscious, about what just happened and what it means about you. Most people let these micro-narratives run unexamined. They complete the task and move on. The subconscious logs it without comment, and the old identity reasserts itself by default. Stage 3 intercepts that process. You are going to narrate what just happened, out loud, in writing, or in deliberate internal monologue, using the language of the installed identity. Not praise, not celebration, confirmation. You open the document, you narrate. Of course I did. That's what I do. Not good job. That implies surprise, which implies the old identity is still the baseline. Of course, the language of a person for whom this behavior is already obvious, already consistent, already unremarkable. This is the gaslight. You are telling yourself a story about your own behavior that is slightly ahead of where the evidence actually sits. You are narrating the pattern before it is fully established, and the subconscious, which cannot fully distinguish between a story that is true and a story that is consistently told, begins treating the narrative as fact. Over time, the story and the behavior converge completely, not because you deceived yourself into something false, because you used narrative as a tool for identity construction, which is precisely what narrative has always been. Every identity you currently hold was built the same way. Someone told you a story about who you were, a parent, a teacher, a peer, a failure, a success, and you repeated it until it became the operating system. You are simply doing it on purpose this time, with awareness, in the direction you choose. The language you use in the real-time narrative matters. Avoid anything that implies effort or struggle. I push through reinstalls the old identity by acknowledging the resistance as significant. Use language that implies ease, inevitability, and consistency. Done. As expected, that's the pattern, nothing unusual. The mind follows the story. Write it carefully. There will be moments, and they will feel significant, when the old identity fights back. These moments tend to cluster at 3 points. The initial installation phase, when the new identity feels most fraudulent. The first genuine test, when something goes wrong and the old narrative offers itself as explanation. And the plateau, when the behavior has become somewhat consistent but the identity hasn't fully solidified yet. At each of these points, the dissonance spikes. The gap between the installed belief and the current behavior becomes briefly visible, and the subconscious generates discomfort to resolve it. The old identity says, "See, this isn't really you. You knew it wasn't true. You were pretending." This is the critical juncture. What you do in this moment determines whether the installation holds. You do not argue with the voice. You do not try to out-reason it. You do not reach for motivation or inspiration or evidence of your progress. All of those responses give the old narrative a platform. They treat it as a legitimate interlocutor, which elevates its authority. Instead, you do the minimum. Immediately, without deliberation, you perform the non-negotiable action that the new identity would perform, directly in response to the spike. Not after the feeling passes, not when you feel ready. Now. The dissonance spike is not a warning. It is a test. And the only response that moves the installation forward is behavioral proof, delivered immediately, without emotional engagement. Every time you respond to a spike with action, you deposit another unit of evidence into the subconscious ledger. Enough deposits, and the old narrative loses its credibility with your own mind. Not through argument, through demonstration. You are gaslighting the old self out of existence, quietly, consistently, without announcing it. Identity calcification is the point at which the installed belief stops requiring maintenance. In the early phases of this protocol, there is a gap between who you've declared yourself to be and who your behavior confirms you are. That gap is the engine. It generates the dissonance that drives the behavior forward. But the gap is also where the vulnerability lives. If you stop feeding the evidence plant, the gap widens again, and the old identity reclaims the space. Calcification happens when the evidence base becomes so dense, so consistent, and so long-running that the new identity is no longer a claim being defended, It is a simple fact about a pattern of behavior that is beyond reasonable dispute, even by your own subconscious. The timeline for calcification is not fixed. It depends on the complexity of the identity being installed, the depth of the old narrative it's replacing, and the consistency of the evidence planting. For simple behavioral identities, I am someone who begins immediately. Calcification can happen within weeks of consistent execution. For deeper identity restructuring, I am someone who operates without fear of judgment. It takes longer because the old narrative has more emotional mass. What you can do is accelerate the process. Stack multiple small evidence plants that all confirm the same identity. Create environmental conditions that make the non-negotiable minimum effortless. Narrate each completion in the language of the new identity. And, critically, begin to socialize the identity externally. When you tell other people who you are, you add an entirely new layer of consistency pressure. The social self and the private self want to cohere. If you have told your environment that you are someone who executes, you have created a second accountability structure that operates automatically without requiring your conscious attention. The social identity becomes a mirror that reflects the installed belief back at you, and the mind works to maintain congruence between the two. This is not performance. It is strategic use of social psychology in your own service. A clarification that belongs in this video, because the framework is powerful enough to be misused. What we have described is not delusional thinking. Delusional thinking is the installation of beliefs that are factually impossible and the resistance of all disconfirming evidence. The Gaslight protocol installs beliefs that are behaviorally achievable and uses behavior to confirm them. The beliefs become true through consistent action. That is not delusion. That is identity-based behavior change, which is one of the most well-supported mechanisms in behavioral science. It is also not the suppression of authentic self. The premise that there is a fixed authentic self that can be suppressed is itself a belief, and one without strong empirical support. The self is constructed. It has always been constructed. What you are doing is choosing the architect rather than defaulting to whoever was in the room when you were most impressionable. And it is not bypassing emotion. The dissonance you feel in this process is real, and we are not asking you to pretend otherwise. We are asking you to change what you do with it. Emotion is data. It is not command. The ability to feel the resistance and execute anyway is not suppression. It is exactly the psychological sophistication that the highest performers in any domain have spent years developing. You are not lying to yourself. You are building yourself. There is a difference, and the only thing that makes one true and the other false is time and consistency. Every identity you currently carry was installed without your permission. By a parent's offhand comment. By a teacher who didn't know your name after 2 months. By a single failure that arrived at the wrong developmental moment. By years of accumulated micro-narratives that you accepted because no one told you that you had the option to reject them. You have been living inside a constructed self for your entire life. You just didn't build it. The only question this video raises, the only question that matters after everything we've walked through, is whether you are going to continue letting that construction run on its original blueprints, or whether you are going to pick up the tools yourself. The Gaslight protocol is not a trick. It is a technology, one the mind has always used, on you, without your consent, with no particular interest in your flourishing. What changes now is who's running it.